with you. It's so great to talk to a curious and passionate group. Um, and so, yeah, I'm going to tell you about Chesapeake Bay marshes from the perspective of the Chesapeake Bay Sentinel Site Cooperative, and I will go deeply into what that group is, as well as a little bit of Maryland Sea Grant. First off, I do want to share the land acknowledgement that is part of the University of Maryland and Maryland Sea Grant, which is that we sit in the ancestral lands of the Piscataway people, and as part of their historic responsibility to advocate for the winged and the four-legged and those who crawl. I'm paraphrasing here, just our responsibility for clean air and pristine waters, and to ensure our physical environment is in the condition that we inherited and that there's health and prosperity in future generations. And so today I'm going to again share what the cooperative is, and what we do, and then jump into sort of, you guys know what marshes are, but so I'll go through it quickly about the stressors that they're facing and that we're sort of focusing on. I am assuming that folks on this call already value marshes, but we're sort of going to dig into the subtleties of that and how people might value different things about marshes, and how we can all come together or diversify our interest. And with that in mind, how we're trying to move forward to manage and preserve marshes. And then I'll just wrap it up with these further research questions and then open it up for your questions as well. So Maryland Sea Grant is well, there's sea grants in every coastal state, and they're generally tied to land grant institutions, your universities that have the agricultural extension programs. If they're on the coast, they'll also have a sea grant program. And so we get our budget and sort of designation by Congress each year, and we use both funds from Congress and through state funds and other funding mechanisms to push that money back out into the research community, so that they can pursue different questions related to the marine and coastal environment, as well as support education, such as students and K through 12 students, as well as graduate students and interns and fellowships out of Sea Grant. And then we do extension, where we try to bring together interested public or different decision makers and those working towards different coastal issues together to have discussions to try to move the needle on some of these issues, and generate some progress or ask some questions, and ultimately do different sort of outreach programs. So some of our extension agents do rain barrels and rain gardens. And then if you are interested in blue catfish, we just released just yesterday our magazine, Chesapeake Quarterly, which is dedicated to blue catfish this issue. You know, what they eat, how we can eat them, and all sorts of issues tied to that species. So that's just one quick example of some of the outreach we do. So please, I think visiting the website can really get you oriented about some of the things we can do and any ways that you can learn or be involved. And then, as you heard, I am the Coastal Resilience Coordinator, and I got my start here solely as the Chesapeake Bay Sentinel Site Cooperative Coordinator. Here is our mission statement, which is a pretty broad umbrella. And so I'll sort of break that down into how this mission statement sort of has translated to what we do day to day. So we take science findings from local observations across the Chesapeake Bay to improve planning and management decisions regarding sea level rise and ecological changes. So we break this apart. The Chesapeake Bay part's pretty obvious, but it also includes the coastal bays. So we're not just the Chesapeake Bay watershed, but also like the barrier islands in the Atlantic side. What we mean by Sentinel Site is sort of this canary in the coal mine where we're doing monitoring and can, from long-term monitoring, raise awareness of what we think can be happening at a larger level. And so Sentinel sites are sort of scattered across our region, and they weren't necessarily talking to one another. They were all sort of doing the similar thing and had a similar mission, but they had no reason to be in the same space and share their data and form relationships. So the cooperative is this idea that talking to one another will get us farther. Our motto is that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So getting the parts to talk to each other could go from this individual site-specific story to a more regional narrative and story of what's happening, particularly in our marshes across the Chesapeake Bay. So when we say local observations, it really is tied to that marsh data. And so I'm going to use marsh and tidal wetlands pretty interchangeably throughout my talk as I keep chatting. But before I do that, we made a video, and I feel a little weird turning it over to a video so quickly, but I wanted to show this so that you see some of the people on the team, as well as sort of the sweeping views of the marshes that we're talking about, paired with some pretty nice music. So I'm going to be ambitious and click this link, otherwise. Okay. Do I need to share my screen again for you to see it? The video on YouTube?
I don't know. It's not showing right now, so.
Okay, then yeah, I'm gonna do a quick reshare. Okay. All right, so let me know if you guys have any issues with hearing or seeing this, but I think we're in the right place now. And then I'll make it larger.
I'm Alan Cunningham. I've been here about 20 years. And in that 20 years, we've seen a lot of change. When we first came here, we had a sandy beach in front of our bulkhead. Now there's no beach. Even at low tide, the water comes right up to the bulkhead. I don't know what's happening. I don't know how quickly we're going to find a solution, but I know we need a solution. We really need to know
how coastal systems are responding to sea level rise. So we work with researchers across the Chesapeake Bay region to collect a variety of parameters, like water level.
We want to know how the land is responding to sea level rise. So we measure elevation change in coastal marshes,
as well as using GPS to measure large-scale vertical land motion. We're also collecting other environmental data, such as water quality,
vegetation composition and density,
and atmospheric conditions.
To better understand how Chesapeake Bay marshes are responding to sea level rise, we measure the same parameters at an array of Sentinel sites around the bay, each with unique geologic and hydrologic characteristics. Like the coastal salt marsh at the Virginia Coast Reserve.
And the salt marsh at the Chesapeake Bay Reserve in Virginia.
Stored marsh at Poplar Island.
tidal freshwater marsh at Chuck Bay.
Tidal freshwater forested wetlands at the Rice River Center.
Working together, we can leverage research at a local scale to help formulate a comprehensive understanding of Chesapeake Bay response to sea level rise as a whole.
Okay, so there we go. And now I'll return to my PowerPoint. And so, as you dropped in the chat, there are certainly a variety of beautiful wetlands and marsh sites throughout Maryland and Virginia. The Sentinel site designation is really tied to that suite of monitoring, so that we can have this record through time to say these are how our marshes are changing. And as sort of that video demonstrated, being in communication, taking that data and telling that story to policymakers, we hope, will have an impact to better prepare for any threats and better manage our marshes. And so, as you saw in the end, there are a bunch of different organizations and institutions tied to each of the Sentinel sites. Poplar Island, for example, I think represents like 4 or more of these different logos, since that is such a group effort. But as you can sort of see just from the amount of logos, we're working across different agencies and institutions, which sometimes just because they have their own way of doing things, were siloed and weren't didn't have reason or space to come together. And that's what the cooperative created a space to do. And so you saw some of the folks across the Sentinel sites who join regular calls to talk about what they're seeing and ways we can collaborate and pull our data together, or just say, this is an issue that I'm dealing with and everybody else I seem to talk to is dealing with. Maybe this needs to be a greater, bigger conversation where we bring in more of the community to discuss. And so, as you saw in the video, a selection of these, there's 8 official Sentinel sites: Assateague National Seashore, Blackwater, which I know at least some of you are familiar with, the National Wildlife Refuge. CB NEAR stands for Chesapeake Bay National Estuarine Research Reserves, and there's one in Virginia and there's one in Maryland that have multiple sites under their umbrella. There's Poplar Island, there's the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, the Virginia Coastal Reserve, as well as the Rice River Center out of the Virginia Commonwealth University. And so the video gave you a sense of where some of those are. This map right here also shows where some of those sites are located. The Virginia Coastal Reserve technically is very big, though, their research can be at a much more focused scale. And you can just get a sense of some of the metrics of the monitoring that they do. I'm going to talk mostly about these surface elevation tables, given that they are sort of a gauge point against sea level rise. And so even though there are 8 Sentinel sites, there are other sites that we know of that have maybe 4 of the 5 monitoring regimens in place. And, it's silly to certainly exclude them from the conversation. So other sites such as the Maryland Coastal Bays program, some academic research in Southern Maryland, Mallows Bay, the National Marine Sanctuary. Those folks are also in our conversations and are, great contributors to some of those questions and collaborations that we do. And so I've been sort of gliding past what a marsh is, and I assume, yeah, that most of you are familiar with this. But just to break it down, each marsh, um, well, is maybe has a different composition of low marsh and high marsh, and making that designation comes down to how exposed it is to the tide. And so low marsh will be pretty continuously inundated, and high marsh will certainly have saturated soils, but might not shouldn't have as regular inundation. And so given those water levels, different plants adapt to those levels of inundation. So low marsh typically has Spartina alterniflora, and high marsh typically has Spartina patens. And this makes both the water level influences the vegetation, which then of course influences the wildlife. So the salt marsh sparrow and some of our other endangered or threatened bird wetland species tend to prefer the high marsh. And of course, fish where like it where it's wetter, and so low marsh can be really important fish nursery. But as these waters levels change, the spread and composition of marshes change as well. And so that will become very obvious as I keep going. And so while each marsh might be high marsh and low marsh, the overall shape of the marsh, the geomorphology, can influence how the marsh changes over time and sort of what threats and vulnerabilities it has. And so Assateague and Chincoteague, for example, are back barrier marshes, and you know how back barrier islands have these different very dynamic systems and rollover events. And so that marsh is changing and perhaps moving closer to the mainland over time. You can also sort of visualize here how a headland or point marsh is more exposed to erosion. The island, I think it's possible that some islands grow over time, but more commonly these marshes are shrinking and you know, have their patch size that might be getting smaller. The most common sort of marsh that you might think of is a mainland fringe marsh. That's just a marsh on the shore that goes whatever distance inward. We broke that up further because if that mainland fringe marsh is high enough in the tidal regime to be freshwater, it tends to have a whole different suite of vegetation and you know, sort of function and related issues. So we pulled out the tidal fresh designation. And then if your marsh is surrounded by impervious surface and a lot of development, it's just dealing with, it has its own strengths and weaknesses. And so we thought urban cluster marshes deserved a separate designation and related conversation. I wanted to share all this just because what you saw in the video and those Sentinel sites represent a good chunk of these different types of geomorphologies. And by anybody reaching out to me or the cooperative, I'm able to say, you know, the marsh that you have in mind, if you want to learn more about it, it might not mean going to down the road to the next marsh. It might mean going across the bay to talk to somebody who has a similar geomorphology to you. So making those connections and learning about your marsh may in fact mean connecting to somebody pretty far away, but that has a pretty similar marsh type to you. So just this week, I was at a meeting at the Chop Tank, and they have questions about their tidal swamps. And so I connected them with Jug Bay, I connect them with the Rice River Center, and even a similar Sentinel site program exists in North Carolina. And so talking about those forested tidal wetlands and making those connections is something that the cooperative tries to facilitate as much as we can. And so as the video made clear, and the request for good news, I'll do my best. I think the good news is that a lot of people care and are trying to save our marshes, and we're working really hard and thoughtfully on that. But we're facing a pretty big threat, which is sea level rise. And so these curves are pulled from the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. They've inked these report cards that are pretty jam-packed with information. Um, and I won't dwell on this. You can see that the curve is going upward, which means sea level is rising. And while this has geographic or geologically been the case for many hundreds of thousands of years, the fact that the curve is accelerating upward means that we're having dramatic differences in life, human lifespans. And that's harder for our ecosystems to keep up with. But we're monitoring, researching that to see just how they are adapting. And so one thing that our cooperative group tried to do was say, okay, let's actually try to put on paper all the different variables that are affecting how a marsh functions. And so this is just sort of a conceptual diagram of, again, those multiple variables that influence how a marsh grows and expands or shrinks. And so one thing that I learned on the job that I didn't put the pieces together before was how different nutrient levels influence plant growth. So if you are planting or have a soil that's pretty nitrogen heavy, it means you're going to have a lot of top growth. But that might mean that you have a shallower root system. And because of that, we might want to think about the amount of fetch or wave action that we have, because if you're too top heavy and you have some strong waves, this causes your vegetation to be vulnerable and potentially collapse. And so all these sort of variables that we list here interplay with one another and can help determine whether your marsh is quote unquote healthy or it is degrading in some way. And so we do our best to try to monitor all these different variables, and where we'd like to go and have a stronger analysis is trying to model all this out more firmly and think about all these correlations and track those down with the entire suite of Sentinel site data, which is a lot and which we frankly need additional funding for in order to take on. So here I'll just again move into some of those stressors. This is maybe the darker part of the talk, but understanding these, is really important so that we know how best to deal with them. And so with sea level rise, we can expect the marshes to be flooded longer and more inland, which can change again the vegetation composition. Sea level rise can also lead to erosion so that we're losing the marsh edge. As sea level rises, it's pushing saltwater further up into the tidal regime. And so plants not only, of course, are adapted to a certain level of wetness, they're also adapted to a certain level of salt. And so marsh plants like salt, but certainly more upland plants can't handle that salinity change and can sometimes make way for marshes. And then sea level rise and climate change in general, more storm disturbances, stronger hurricanes, which can certainly beat up a marsh as well. And so while sea level rise is really a primary concern, that's also paired with these other stressors, such as development, invasive species, again, nutrient levels via pollution and eutrophication. Pollution also in terms of like heavy metals and such, or debris. And so I have a picture of Phragmites here that could definitely be a full discussion, just because it has its pros and cons. Certainly doesn't yield as much biodiversity or habitat value, but is pretty good at erosion control and holding in carbon. So that's a really interesting discussion. Again, one of those things where we say, are enough people talking about Phragmites that we want to have like a bigger group meeting and talk about how best we manage it. So the potential good news is that naturally, and what has been happening, geologically, for eons, is that if the water rises and you have a sort of gentle enough slope, the water just sort of moves or migrates inward. And so what was once mud flood, or rather what was once high marsh can become low marsh, and what was once, more upland can become high marsh, etc. That can't happen if there is a parking lot or a bulkhead that prevents the marsh from moving inward. So that's certainly something that when we model what's happening and try to forecast the amount of marsh that can exist in the future, because of this migration potential, some models predict, hey, we'll have a good amount in the future, but we certainly have to eliminate spots where the marsh isn't allowed to migrate forward. And we call that sort of coastal squeeze, where that potential exists. And so I won't dwell much on these two graphics. Frankly, they're not graphics that I generated, so I don't want to trip up on the percentages too much. The point is there's a certain amount of wetlands that we still have, and there's a Chesapeake Bay program goal to try to make sure those marshes stay in place and are enhanced. And then there's a certain amount that are in greater need of more intensive restoration. And so our goal is 85,000 acres of restoration and 150 acres of enhancement. What I grabbed here is how we are making our way towards those goals. You can see that this straight line of bars each year seems a little questionable, and I don't have the answer behind that. I pulled this from Chesapeake Progress, which is a pretty cool website for you to see how we have progressed across different Chesapeake Bay program wetland, or not just wetland, all sorts of environmental goals. And so if you haven't checked out Chesapeake Progress yet, you might find that interesting. The point from this slide is that we are not close to reaching our goals. We're only 5% of the way there in terms of restoration, and we're better in terms of like preservation and enhancement, but still significantly under where we hope to be next year. And so the good news is that we realize we haven't done a great job, and that there's now a lot of attention and intention to try to do better for our tidal wetlands. And I don't think this, again, is much of a sell to this group, but marshes, why care about marsh acreages? Doesn't matter if you have green or natural infrastructure over a wall or a bulkhead. And so this next section, I just want to talk about how folks value marshes in different ways. And I like this graphic, but I think you guys know this, so I won't dwell on it. We're talking about marshes that pure vegetation, though some marshes might benefit from some help of sort of some breakwaters, or other residents might be more comfortable with sort of this mix of having an edge or a sill to help reduce some of the wave and erosion potential. And other folks are just most familiar with revetments and bulkheads, so they think that's what they need, and we want to potentially introduce some of these greener, softer techniques. Again, that's sort of a whole separate talk. But whatever choice that residents or towns, public lands make doesn't have a pretty significant impact down the road per se. And so this research came out of the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science rather than my particular cooperative, but I really think this is a cool study where they ran the models to say, what if everybody did have green infrastructure or natural shorelines? And if they did that in situation A, you can see that the max water levels are mostly on this green or blue side, meaning on the lower end. But if everybody hardens their shoreline, especially on the lower shore and in Virginia, what that is almost creating maybe like a funnel, and it's pushing so much water because it can't absorb on the landscape, it's pushing water upward into the Chesapeake Bay. So folks in Baltimore actually need to be pretty mindful and maybe persuasive for folks on the lower shore and everywhere else to adopt greener infrastructure. Otherwise, Baltimore is going to see a lot more water coming their way over time. And so we're not really there yet in those conversations, but this research certainly is a stepping stone towards that. And so marshes are valuable in a multitude of ways, but breaking this up, you can see that there's habitat value, there's coastal protection value. I think that point was really driven home during Katrina days and how much marshes could have improved conditions in New Orleans. We're really interested in carbon sequestration potential now, since marshes and peatlands really absorbed way more carbon than most other ecosystems. And so that being said, a bird wants different things than a fish. And so when different conservation groups are coming together, some are really saying, I want a marsh to protect fish. And Audubon, is a prime example of folks who are trying to protect birds. And that doesn't mean, sometimes that can mean selecting one marsh over the other. And so we wanted to see more from the conservation community about what sort of marsh can maybe have the most ecosystem services provided. And so what we did was we held a workshop and we brought in researchers and the managers of the different parks and the regulators and other government officials and stakeholders, and we asked them, sit at your specialty table, which was your ecosystem services, and then we're going to talk about these different geomorphologies, and you basically say within 5 minutes, so this is a really rapid assessment, and I would be curious how this group does the assessment too, but just say this is a high, medium, or low priority, high being green, yellow being medium, and red being low in terms of your ecosystem service. And we created this sort of matrix, which is a lot to absorb, so I'm gonna just run you through some examples of what the group sort of talked about. So for example, the bird table talked about back barrier marshes, and they said, you know what, back barrier marshes are really important for bird conservation in the Chesapeake Bay. There's a good amount of back barrier marshes. They have the highest density of salt marsh sparrow. We think they're more sustainable because of the sediment supply that they get. But they do realize that the more developed the back barrier marsh is, the more predators bird species may have. Overall, our 5 minutes are up, we're moving to the next marsh. We say this gets a green square, high priority. Meanwhile, the coastal protection table looked at back barrier marshes and they said, you know what? It depends. If it's a big back barrier marsh, that could offer some good protection, but if it's small, maybe less. Is it really the marsh, or is it the whole island that is in fact protecting us? A lot of islands are not really on the front line of this issue, but there's a way to sort of set up for constant restoration. So those were things they considered, and they said a back barrier marsh is sort of a medium priority in terms of coastal protection. And then just an example of a low priority is carbon sequestration in an urban cluster marsh. They made a lot of good points that these marshes are going to be hard to maintain, and given that they're typically small, their ability to sequester carbon just isn't that good. So urban clusters, really are great for like educational value, but purely in terms of carbon sequestration, not so much. And so that's sort of what that matrix meant. So I'll click back to it real quick for you now that you have that context. And so you can try to absorb what all these sort of icons mean. What I did was put just a numerical value on those different shapes. And so if it was a green, I gave it a 3, and if it was a low priority, I gave it a 1, just so you can see this average. So this isn't statistics. I didn't run like a statistics significance test on it. So this is really just another way of visualizing that matrix. But you can see that in general, folks rated a mainland fringe marsh more highly than the other marshes, but these other marshes are fairly similar to one another. So they all sort of balance out in different ways in terms of priorities for different ecosystem services. I then said, okay, when the ecosystem services tables were having their discussion, what were the things they were talking about that were important for their marsh? And then I just, if these were the different criteria, and I put a dot if the ecosystem service table mentioned it. And so, some things are unique to the ecosystem service. The bird group really talked about predators and high marsh habitat, and that wasn't as important to different ecosystem services. And so at a glance, you can see that what's important sort of across nearly all those services is that there's longevity to these marshes. They have the ability to stay above the sea level, or they have a sediment source to help build that elevation up. Otherwise, bigger is better in terms of these ecosystem services. And ideally, the marsh would be in this sweet spot that it would be able to protect a community nearby. So in the final phase of my talk, I'll talk about the things we're thinking about when we want to manage these different marshes. And something that emerged out of the National Park Service is this concept of resisting, accepting, or directing the land that you're using. And so RAD for short, it's usually in this order, but I'm going to talk about it in terms of acceptance first. Acceptance means that you're not going to intervene. You're going to have passage management. You're just going to let what happens happen. Resist means you are going to intervene. You're going to actively manage the site so that you are either creating marsh or you're heavily restoring the marsh. You're doing everything you can really to protect that marsh in its place. And direct is basically saying, this site is going to change and I'm going to embrace that change. And in a marsh world, that means allowing for marsh migration. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more before we wrap up the hour. So when we talk about acceptance, I think a lot of it comes down to, are there marshes that are able to maintain themselves without intervention? Because if so, that's a great investment for managers or funders to try to acquire the marsh or let that marsh be. What they need to think about is that marsh sitting above sea level rise? Is it getting enough sediment so that it's rising over time? Is it big enough that if there's some erosion, the marsh will be okay? And so our Sentinel sites have the ability to track that elevation change. They do that with the surface elevation tables on which you saw briefly in the video. And so in our cooperative, we have 470 different surface elevation tables. And you can go to our website, the Chesapeake Bay SSC, Sentinel Site Cooperative, and go to this map. And you can click on any one of these and learn all the metadata, all the different characteristics associated with this monitoring instrument. And so at a glance, pink dots are negative, green are positive, blue are no trend. And so for the most part, there are a few, but there aren't as many marshes that are losing elevation, that are sinking. There are some that are sort of just holding steady and not really gaining or losing, but we have 186 that are positive, they're gaining elevation. And then there's a whole bunch that are unavailable. That's because our scientists maybe haven't published their data yet. They're not quite ready to commit to a trend rate. Some of these elevation tables are really young, meaning that we want at least 5 years of data before we make a trend. So anyway, even though there's a majority of them that are gaining elevation, the question is still, are they gaining at a rate that exceeds sea level rise? Otherwise, the sea level is going to beat it. And so I don't have those numbers to share. We want, again, to pull that all together. But frankly, the sites are still sort of independent enough that they do things each their own way, and sort of pooling together that mass effort just hasn't quite happened, since each site, is a full-time gig in and of itself. And so the other thing is, if we don't do anything and sort of the nature does its thing, is that okay? Landscape transitions therefore will happen. We're going to expect salinities to change, and certainly invasive species are going to have a presence in this. This is a very small rural cemetery, and you can see Phragmites poking in and certainly on the verge of dominating this cemetery. And this is something that the Eastern Shore is seeing a lot of, is just this this landscape transitioning and wetlands moving closer to them. A lot of times that can mean Phragmites coming, ever closer to their backyards or their establishments. So if we want to resist, there are various restoration techniques. Thin layer placement is when we put a thin layer of sediment on the marsh so that its elevation is raised. And so, in my opinion, it looks pretty ugly at the start. It's just a bunch of like mud slurry scattered across the marsh, but the vegetation comes back after a couple of seasons, and then it's in a higher elevation capital than it was before. So we think about thin layer placement when the marsh is already sort of drowning and needs to be raised above. In more high marsh situations, sometimes water is trapped and sitting on the landscape and creating these runnels or these very thin, small ditches to pull the water off is a way to preserve the high marsh habitat. So those are probably our most active ones, as well as erosion control, again, just to try to protect some of the wave action from knocking out, especially new plantings. And then fire is a tool as well, though less common. Historically, these marshes would burn every so often. It might be a way to help control invasive species. And so I think one of our biggest examples of restoration and sort of creating something from nothing was how our Poplar Island went from, I think, a couple hundred acres to like less than 10. And so the Army Corps was able to say, okay, we can restore that to what it once was using dredge material from Baltimore Harbor. They have now built up this marsh or this island and have designated high and low marsh habitat. And so you saw in the video that we've been closely monitoring that, especially because that sediment source is kind of funky, and thinking about the different nutrient levels in there and how best we can get this right at Poplar Island. If anyone has been to Poplar Island, you can sort of see for yourself that it has been really utilized by wildlife and seems like a really important space for diamondback terrapin and different migratory birds and shorebirds. And so it's generally a success, though very expensive, 40, I can't keep track of the numbers, but multi-million, tens of millions of dollars to create Poplar Island. That being said, there are other marsh creation projects in the works. Barren Island and James Island are now slated for the Army Corps to rebuild and restore. Also, you might know about the Middle Branch constructed wetlands, really great urban wetlands that are being created. And, there's, when we think about those ecosystem services, a lot of educational value here. And so really great, but also a very high price tag. And, something to consider is some wetlands have higher price tags than others. And so what was saved and created here, you know, you maybe could have had a lot more wetlands just in a more remote area. And so that balancing act is something that's pretty interesting, and a story about who funds what. And then getting into marsh migration. So as we saw earlier, if the water rises, potentially the marsh just moves inward as well. That means that it's probably taking over whatever the uplands were. That might be forest, so you might see more ghost forest, but it might also be agricultural land or even residential properties. And so while marsh migration might seem like a good thing, and it very well might be, we still have questions about it. We're wondering how the transition occurs. Can we help facilitate marsh migration to happen? And how do we exactly do that? Does that mean cutting down the forest that was there so that the marsh can move in more easily? Is that the case? Should we leave the ghost forest in place so that marshes just sort of move around it? If marshes are migrating, what's that composition? We don't really want it to be Phragmites, but is that what's happening? How is wildlife adapting? So a lot of questions. And while from there's a certain sector of society that says yay marsh migration, but there's another side that says marsh encroachment might be a better term, where you know those agricultural lands on the eastern shore are seeing on the coast, more water coming in and seeing this environmental pressure of their agricultural land becoming more and more like a wetland. We're seeing those cemeteries and other properties feeling again more and more like a wetland. And you guys have probably seen and heard about the ghost forests where, you know, these upland coastal maritime forests can't withstand that water and salinity. And so you see a bunch of snags and dead trees. And what to do about that? So how do we want to gain marsh at the cost of losing these other land uses? One thing that the cooperative did was have a series of listening sessions with coastal farmers, and so they very much are seeing changes to their land. Everybody reported that they're seeing some change, and most commonly that the soils are wet longer and that there's more water on the land. They're seeing wildlife changes, they're seeing the ghost forest, and they're seeing a lot more wetland plants on their property. So we asked them that same sort of rad question. In the short term and in the long term, are you trying to protect your agricultural land? Are you just going to let things happen as they happen? Or are you going to try to transition your land to something new? Are you going to turn it into a wetland, either with a conservation easement or use that wetland for hunting leases? Will there be a carbon market to help support that question? And so in the short term, folks might either resist or accept, and you can see this was a small sample, but overall in the majority said in the long term they are planning to transition their land into something else, again most likely turning it into perhaps a wetland. So those are the sort of buckets of management style. I sit with a bunch of researchers, and so we have a lot more questions, right? Never-ending questions of how these ecosystems do, especially with climate change affecting ecological processes over time. They want to know if you do restoration here, what happens over there? What are the downstream effects? As we do restoration, it's really hard for us to say, job well done, we did it, or did we not do so great? How can we improve? Marsh carbon dynamics are really of high interest right now. Again, what want to absorb as much carbon as we can, and how do we do that? And then as we're talking about all these different marsh geomorphologies, we don't know as much about tidal freshwater marsh as we want to, and that system is really going to be interesting as salinities change. And then there's the whole management and implementation side. And so about 87 or in the 80s, percent of sort of our shorelines are in private lands. And so if we want to do large scale restoration, it probably means a lot of neighbors coming together and trying to conserve their properties. And how can we support those landowners or contractors to plan for, you know, long-term restoration decades ahead of time? Who owns the carbon is becoming a question. And like I mentioned before, when is something successfully restored? We don't really have that metric in place. And so just some overall themes for the future. We want to make sure our marshes are sticking around, and some of that may have this ecosystem service angle, whether it is the greenhouse emissions goals that we're trying to reach and trying to retain carbon and the blue economy. To do any of this, we need more people able to do the things. Certainly my group is small and mighty, but we need more monitoring and we need more technical assistance out there for many different local governments and landowners to know what to do. We have to think about these transitions that are happening and ways to support them. Coastal resilience easements, realizing that your land's shifting and how the easement can move with it. Keeping the critical area commission in Maryland applicable to climate change. And what I didn't touch on, but is a pretty interesting issue, is sea level rise is not going to be kind to septic tanks. And so that we are potentially at risk of a lot of stinky pollution as sea levels rise. And then as I talked about sort of with these urban cluster marshes, there's only so much funding, and so which marsh we try to restore or protect can become a really good question, and something that will need to be hashed out. And so who cares about what and who makes their case best is something that we want to be mindful or potentially strategic about. And so I think on that note, I can wrap things up. Thank you for listening for way over time. So yeah, I'm really I apologize for that. I am happy to take any questions, though I have a child to put to bed, so can't take too many.
All right, Taryn, thank you so much. If you can just unshare and come back, we'll open it up for a couple questions, which would be great. Yeah. Let me just put a spotlight on you right here. Okay. All right, if you have a question, you can raise your hand and I can call on you. Okay, go ahead, Barbara.
I'm just wondering, what is a priority in Virginia? Is it the ocean, the bay, or is it the land invasives? Just curious how you would prioritize those three.
I don't think Virginia like the state of Virginia has a certain stance across how they would value the three of them. They did release a coastal resilience master plan, and that tries to address as many components of resilience as it can. I I I will say, and this might not really be answering your question, Virginia's stance has been a lot of acceptance or passive management, and I think there's maybe now more pressure towards active management. And so you asked whether they value the water, the land, or
Or the bay.
the bay. I certainly think I I don't think they value the bay more than the coastal marshes. I think they think, strategically about Norfolk and all the infrastructure there and those vulnerabilities. But I think they value everything. Just I think it comes down to some site specific criteria or what's happening on that local scale.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Jeff has a question, just an interesting tidbit. Have you heard about the National Aquarium floating wetland? And it's been visited by river otters.
Yeah, I think those wetlands are such a amazing example of how, quickly wildlife, is jumping on potential habitat. I haven't seen them in person yet, but seems like they're doing great.
All right. Do we have any other questions?
Um,
Go ahead, Barbara.
I have one more. So if you are to donate for the bay, what components are the most important right now? Restoring the oysters, or is it preserving land by adding sand, or what things look ahead? There's barrier things people used to put to keep erosion from occurring, like bushes, and I don't know if that ever took off as well as they hoped, but
Yeah, I think land acquisition is just really, really important. I think frankly, a lot of rural areas still see so much benefit to growth, and yet at another scale, we really just, in order for our habitats to thrive, they need to stay rural. And so land conservation, I think it is really important moving forward. I also think it's personal preference. If you love oysters, continue to invest in oysters. If you like seagrasses, that restoration effort is still necessary, and they still certainly want donation to increase that. Um I guess my vote is just land acquisition. I see a lot of value to that in various forms, right? Forests are just as valuable and important as marshes and such.
All right. Any other questions? Well, thank you so much, Taryn. This was fascinating, especially that the data about the hardening of the southern part of the bay, pushing the water up to Baltimore. I mean, that was unexpected in terms of a consequence. It's always unexpected what happens when one thing changes. The other thing that was unexpected for me is that people are just got to the point now at they understand that change is inevitable, and they're going to roll with it, and especially with the farmers and the agriculture. That I think that's a positive as well. So we'll see how we can adapt and move forward into this uncertain future, and just will adapt just like the ecosystems will adapt as well.
For sure. Again, I apologize for going over time, but I was happy to give my spiel to you all. And certainly reach out if you wanted to hear any more about marshes, or connect to any of those resources that I shared.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great night. Stay well, stay curious, and stay outside. Go visit a wetland somewhere this week. That's your homework. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.